if systems revolve significantly about who controls capital, not entirely, there are cultural and other factors, but if the control of capital yields great power, and if you have a system design that doesn't deal with who gets to control the capital, you probably don't have a systemic design that will last. So that's the challenge. And if it isn't in the state, and if it's not in the corporations, and it's not in the landed lords, where else might capital be built up in a system that would be democratic, perhaps ecologically sustainable, perhaps concerned with community, and perhaps concerned with the well-being of a larger majority? Well, it turns out there are traditions that have asked that question. Moreover, there are experiments, and a lot of them. Moreover, in the United States, there's a lot going on which begins to suggest a different direction and maybe even a systemic design. So the first argument becomes, if you put it in the state, it concentrates power. But maybe there are other places that, in fact, people can put capital in ways that decentralize power. And maybe, and here's the second part of the argument, there may be pathways forced by the pain of the failing system that allow the transcending slow development of alternative places to build up capital in a democratic form that is decentralized and changes power relationships at the same time as it opens up new vistas and new visions. Maybe. So how do you even begin to get a handle on what that might look like, particularly in the United States? Well, one way is to begin looking around the country, and we do a lot of research on this at the University in Maryland and in the Democracy Collaborative, for alternative structures that democratize the ownership of wealth and that are expanding. That's a starting place. That's not an answer. That's a starting place. And some of them are old structures which are undergoing kind of transformation and renewal, and some of them are new ones. So what do I mean? The most obvious one is the garden variety co-op. One person, one vote, ownership of wealth. There are 130 million Americans who are members of co-ops and credit unions, which is also a co-op form. That's 40% of the society. Very interesting. And the credit unions themselves, been there a long time, standing there, kind of an ordinary, mundane institution. Taken together, they have more capital than any one of the giant 5 big New York banks. There's another place. Most people don't know there are 11 million Americans who are members of worker-owned companies. That's about 3 million more than are members of unions in the private sector. The press, by the way, doesn't cover any of this. It's very important. They don't have the money, and they don't have the interest, they don't have the reporting staffs. So you have to really dig to find out these things that are pretty obvious if you look at them. There are 11 million people in worker-owned companies. Another illustration, suggestive, not definitive, suggestive of a different way to organize the ownership of wealth and capital institutionally. That might be another place to look for building up something more in the direction of a new system. That 25% of American electricity is generated by socialist institutions. I mean really socialist institutions, city-owned utilities and co-ops. And there they exist all around the country. And many of them are beginning to take on new forms. For instance, they're getting into internet development, they're doing green projects, they're becoming oriented to trying to transform different parts of the local economy. And that institution has power which is not yet tapped. And there it is, another form of ownership that is decentralized and gives you another ingredient to begin thinking about as possibly building up. Social enterprise, another form. Now, there are a whole lot of folks involved in social enterprise. There is one called Credo. Credo came out of working assets. It's a company set up and makes a lot of money. It's set up to make money and use it for social and political purposes. And there are several thousand of those around the country that you don't find written about. But again, changing ownership for a political and social purpose. That's another example. The neighborhood corporations are out there as well. There are about 5,000 of them in the country. Some boring, some interesting, and some getting very interesting indeed, the developing large-scale ownership. There's one in New Jersey that has 1,400 employees, very large owner, and owns land and stores, and so by a neighborhood structure. So land ownership is another piece of the puzzle. Land is the critical one in city development. These are, if you like, pebbles and ingredients for something that might be taken and built using these pebbles and ingredients of actual real experience that suggests decentralized ways to own capital. And they are all growing. That's the interesting part of this. And they're growing largely because of pain and difficulty and no answer out of the political and economic system. Everywhere I've gone, you find people trying to build new co-ops, getting very sophisticated about co-op development, land trust development, agriculture. A lot of it's green. And they're beginning to take into their own hands the redesign of this kind of effort. Well, in Ohio today, you'll find more worker-owned companies per capita probably than any other state. Because there aren't any other answers and no jobs, a lot of the country looks like Ohio has looked for the last 30 years. The Rust Belt states went first. Out of that pain, there's also been innovation and sophistication and further development, not just numbers. So in Cleveland today, you will find a complex of large-scale worker-owned companies linked together by a revolving fund and linked together also by a nonprofit corporation so that they make money to help rebuild the community, as well as with the revolving fund, keep starting new worker-owned companies. So what I mean, they're really significant companies. They just opened about 2.5 months ago the largest urban greenhouse in the United States. They have a very large-scale greenhouse, industrial-scale greenhouse, to serve laundry to the hospitals in the area. And also there's a solar installation company online to put in just about double the amount of solar that exists in Ohio. And the idea is to keep building a complex that builds the community. And they're not freestanding worker-owned companies. They're linked together to build the community. They can't run off. And that's the idea. So notice you've got an increase in scale and innovation, and now it's a community building structure. Some of you know about Mondragon in the Basque country of Spain. This is built in part on Mondragon, but the community structure is even more innovative. So the thing to look at there is over 30 years, not only growth in numbers, but growth in sophistication.